Welcome to Clandestine Cases. The quiet hamlet of Little Underhill stirred uncomfortably on the morning of Tuesday, September 12th. A milk cart clattered along the cobbled lane just past 8 when it halted in front of Rose Cottage, a trim, ivy-draped home tucked between a row of honeysuckle bushes and an overgrown yew hedge. The milkman, George Tavers, rang the little bell beside the gate as he did every morning. No answer. He set the bottles down, turned to leave, then stopped. The curtains were drawn, yet the front door hung open by a finger's width. Mrs. Cecilia Harper, the occupant, was known to be obsessively tidy and unfailingly prompt, especially about shutting her doors. A sense of unease needled at him. With a hesitant glance over his shoulder, he nudged the door open and called into the silence. Nothing stirred. The smell of something faintly metallic, mixed with the scent of burnt toast, drifted out. George stepped inside. A teacup lay shattered. In the hallway, its brown contents seeped into the rug. The kitchen light was still on, and in the parlor, slumped at a writing desk with her head against the inkwell, was Mrs. Harper, rigid, unmoving, dead. The constable arrived within the hour, summoned by the rattled milkman. He found no signs of forced entry, no items missing, no struggle evident. Just the corpse of a 73-year-old widow who, by all accounts, had no enemies, no debts, and no illnesses, at least none serious enough to expect her to keel over mid-sentence. Her writing hand still gripped a fountain pen, uncapped, with a half-finished letter blotting the paper. It ended with the words, "You must understand that Tuesday," and nothing more. Dr. Grams pronounced it sudden cardiac arrest, albeit unusual. The coroner confirmed later that there were no bruises, no trauma, and no poison detected. Yet questions lingered. Why had she left the door ajar? Why was there burnt toast in the oven, left as if she'd abandoned it abruptly? And why the cryptic unfinished sentence in the letter? When the vicar's wife, Mrs. Philby, passed along the tale over tea in St. Mary Mead that afternoon, Miss Marple's knitting needles paused mid-row. "She died on a Tuesday?" Miss Marple asked, her tone light but her eyes sharply focused. "How odd, is it?" Mrs. Philby frowned. "I hadn't thought so." Miss Marple resumed knitting, a faint line forming between her brows. "It's just that Mrs. Harper was rather particular about days. I recall she always visited her sister on Tuesdays, every Tuesday without fail, for over 2 decades. She mentioned it at the last garden party. I've never missed a Tuesday, she told me." So what was she doing at home? The question unsettled the vicar's wife more than she cared to admit. By the next morning, the police had quietly closed the matter. No foul play, no motive, no suspect, case concluded. But for Miss Marple, the inconsistencies scratched at something deep and unresolved. She made inquiries, polite and casual. The grocer said Mrs. Harper hadn't collected her usual biscuits on Monday. The postmistress said a letter arrived for her on Saturday, a foreign envelope from Florence, but it hadn't been returned or replied to. A trip to the village library revealed a borrowing slip signed by Mrs. Harper for a detective novel titled "The Woman Who Died on a Tuesday," withdrawn the week prior. Coincidence? Perhaps. But Miss Marple didn't care much for coincidences. She spoke next with the sister, Miss Lillian Brooks, who lived in nearby East Whitlow. Lillian, still trembling from the shock, confirmed the routine. Cecilia always came every Tuesday, rain or shine. She didn't come this week. I thought she'd taken ill, but she never rang. Miss Marple nodded, noting that there was no phone line at Rose Cottage. She would have had to post a letter or walk to the payphone. Yet neither had happened. Back at the cottage, after charming the constable with her usual grandmotherly tact, Miss Marple inspected the scene. The spilled tea, the burnt toast, the letter on the desk. She examined the page again. The words, "You must understand that Tuesday," were inked in a hurried, agitated scrawl. The blot showed her hand had paused. Mid-stroke, something or someone had interrupted her. She noticed the pen was dry, the nib crusted. Odd for someone mid-writing. And then, in the waste bin beside the desk, she found something stranger. Torn fragments of another letter. Not in Mrs. Harper's hand. Most were illegible, but one piece bore the signature, "Yours in urgency, P." She asked the constable if anyone had visited recently. He shrugged. "Only the cleaner, Miss Redford. Comes every Thursday. Said she hadn't seen anything odd." Miss Marple requested to speak with her. Miss Redford was brisk, well-mannered, and not easily flustered. She admitted to finding the house untouched last Thursday. No dishes, no crumbs, no sign Mrs. Harper had eaten. But she didn't think much of it. Maybe she was out. She had a sister, didn't she? And you didn't find it strange that she hadn't left a note? Miss Marple asked gently. Well, no. Miss Redford hesitated. There was a letter on the table, half open. Foreign stamp, I think. I didn't read it. That detail returned to Miss Marple with weight. A letter from Florence. A missing Tuesday. Visit. An open front door. A dry pen. And a final unfinished line about Tuesday. Something had happened that day. And whatever it was, Cecilia Harper had been on the cusp of revealing it when death struck, or was made to look like it had. The mystery deepened when Miss Marple visited the post office again. "Do you keep delivery logs?" she asked. They did. On Monday, no post. On Tuesday morning, one letter delivered, Florentine origin. Yet that letter was nowhere in the house now. Had it been destroyed, removed? Miss Marple's final stop was the library again. She asked about the novel. The librarian, a twitchy man with a fondness for gossip, said it had been returned on Friday. Odd book, he added. Not a real detective story. More a confession disguised as fiction. Set in a village much like this one. Miss Marple asked to borrow it. That night, by candlelight, she read it cover to cover. The story detailed a woman obsessive about routine who uncovers a secret about a man in her past, a wartime betrayal. On a Tuesday, she prepares to expose him. Before she can, she dies. The twist: the death is natural in appearance, but carefully timed and subtly induced by a rare plant extract undetectable in common toxicology tests. Miss Marple closed the book slowly. Her hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from realization. There was no proof yet, but the pattern, the message in fiction and the missing letter pointed to something intentional. Someone had wanted Mrs. Harper silenced on a Tuesday. And, whoever they were, they knew enough to make murder look ordinary. The mystery was far from over. The morning sun cast a pale sheen over Rose Cottage as Miss Marple returned. This time not with a tea cake or idle conversation, but with a purpose. She masked beneath a shawl and a calm demeanor. The constable, Constable Rowley, was stationed out front, sipping lukewarm tea from a tin mug, his stance casual, but his brow slightly furrowed. "Still no suspects, Miss Marple," he said as she approached. "It's all rather quiet. The coroner says it was the heart." No foul play. Ah, the heart, Miss Marple echoed softly, peering over her spectacles at the neat picket fence. So often blamed, yet so rarely questioned. She offered a thin smile and gestured gently toward the door. "May I?" Constable Rowley hesitated for only a moment before opening the gate. "Well, I suppose there's no harm." Inside, the house was much the same. Too much the same, Miss Marple thought. The air still carried the stale scent of extinguished life, mingled faintly with the bitterness of overdone toast. She stood for a long moment in the parlor, her eyes trailing across the room, not with a glance but with a quiet calculation. The letter on the desk untouched, the pen dry, the blotting paper soaked and unmoved. Yet it wasn't the desk that caught her attention this time. It was a small, framed photograph on the mantelpiece, Mrs. Harper, arm in arm with a man in a military uniform, the style dated to the war years. Miss Marple stepped closer, noting a faint crack in the glass across the man's face. Not recent, not accidental. Someone had deliberately pressed a thumb to the glass once, distorting the image underneath. "Her husband died in 47, I believe," she murmured. "No children. But this man—" "Her brother," Constable Rowley supplied, having drifted in behind her. "Peter Harper died in Burma, or so they say. She rarely spoke of him." Miss Marple hummed quietly, but her mind was already elsewhere. A brother presumed dead. Letter from Florence. A novel mirroring Mrs. Harper's fate. The threads pulled tighter. She turned her attention to the writing desk again, this time scanning not for what was present but what was missing. There was no blotting paper for the prior page, no carbon copy. And the waste bin, though mostly filled with household scraps, had one clean corner of white, unburned, crisp, and unusually perfumed. She stooped delicately and retrieved it. Just a corner. But there, in faded violet ink, was the partial name. P. Her eyes lingered on the scent. Lavender. Rare. For a man's stationery. She turned then, slowly, as though the room was speaking to her. The letter, the door ajar, the burnt toast. A sequence, not chaos. A woman interrupted mid-morning routine, someone she trusted, someone she allowed into her home without fuss. And yet, nothing stolen, nothing broken. Just a conversation cut off, a line never finished. "You must understand that Tuesday, back in the village, Miss Marple's path took her to Mrs. Cynthia Redford once more. The cleaner was tending to her front garden, elbow deep in rose clippings. She looked up at the approaching figure with mild surprise. "Miss Marple," she said, brushing soil from her gloves. "Something on your mind?" "Only a question or two," Miss Marple replied with gentle innocence. "You mentioned seeing a letter on the table last Thursday. The one with the foreign stamp. I wonder, did you happen to notice if it was still sealed?" Mrs. Redford pursed her lips. "No, I don't believe it was. Half open, I think. Looked like it had been read. The paper inside was sticking out just a touch." "Curious," Miss Marple said, her eyes narrowing just slightly. "Because that letter isn't anywhere now. And I dare say Mrs. Harper would not misplace something she intended to reply to. She was rather meticulous, you see." The cleaner's smile faltered for a moment. "Well, perhaps she threw it out." Miss Marple replied, pausing as a young boy cycled past with a bark of laughter. But she hadn't yet written a response. And the torn piece I found in her waste bin was on different paper entirely. Violet ink, lavender perfume. Not Italian stationery at all. Mrs. Redford's eyes flickered, barely perceptible. But Miss Marple caught it. Just as she caught the brief motion of her hand moving toward her apron pocket, then stopping. "You think someone took it?" the cleaner asked too quickly. "I think someone didn't want it found," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft and nearly kind, which is not quite the same. There was a pause. The hedge trimmer from the house next door buzzed briefly, then fell silent. Miss Marple studied Mrs. Redford's face. It was composed, but around the edges of the mouth a stiffness had crept. You'd been cleaning there for 3 years, hadn't you?" she asked. "4," the woman corrected. "And never once a Miss Tuesday, I presume." Mrs. Redford gave a tight nod. "But last Tuesday, you didn't see her?" "No." Miss Marple tilted her head. "So how did you know about the burnt toast?" Another flicker. This time not subtle. I must have overheard the constable," the cleaner stammered. "He didn't mention it to anyone. He didn't even notice it himself. I only found it because I looked at the oven." Mrs. Redford's hand clenched slightly, and her voice rose, brittle now. "I've got nothing to do with this." "Oh, I'm not accusing you of anything," Miss Marple said sweetly. "But I do wonder. Who else has access to the cottage besides you?" The cleaner said nothing. The pause stretched. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple stopped by the library once more. The librarian was less twitchy today, perhaps relieved someone was paying attention to something other than overdue fines. "That book," Miss Marple said. "The woman who died on a Tuesday. Do you know who borrowed it before Mrs. Harper?" He blinked. "Why, yes, hold on." He shuffled through the logbook and tapped a name. Redford, Paul Redford. Miss Marple's face did not change, but her mind jolted. Paul. The signature. "Yours in urgency, P." Lavender-scented paper. Violet ink. A letter never found. And a novel eerily predictive. She made her way home, slow but deliberate, her thoughts turning not just to Paul Redford, but to the kind of man who would send warnings through fiction, who would reach across borders with a veiled message, and who would stop a woman from speaking with nothing but a pause, a moment, and a plan. She had no proof yet, but her eye had caught the tremors of deception beginning to ripple beneath the surface. And as always, Miss Marple knew. It was never just the heart that failed. The next morning broke with a steady drizzle, casting a grey veil over the streets of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, wrapped in a pale raincoat and carrying her modest handbag, made her way down to the local constabulary, not to meddle but to politely request a few clarifications. Constable Rowley, ever wary of elderly interference, hesitated but relented when she mentioned the name Paul Redford and hinted at her discovery in the library logbook. The name meant nothing to him, yet, but her tone made him uneasy. "Can't say I know a Paul Redford," he said, scratching his neck. "Related to Cynthia, you think?" "I rather suspect so," Miss Marple replied calmly. "Brothers, perhaps, or a cousin, someone quite close." With that seed planted, she moved next to the vicarage, where gossip flowed more freely. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Philby, met her with a fresh pot of tea and a hunger for tidings. "Paul Redford," she mused, pouring carefully. "Oh yes, that's Cynthia's younger brother. Came back from the continent last year, I believe. Italy, or was it Spain? Something about his work. Never quite settled. Bit of a drifter, if you ask me. Stayed with Cynthia for a month or two, then off again. Came back just a few weeks ago. Around the time of Mrs. Harper's death, in fact," Miss Marple said softly. Mrs. Philby's hand paused on the teapot. Well, I hadn't connected it. But yes, now that you say it. Miss Marple left soon after, her mind sorting names, dates, and tones. The next logical step was to visit Cynthia once more, this time under no pretense. The cleaner was at home, folding laundry on her small porch, visibly tense but hiding it beneath routine. I wonder, Miss Marple began with polite formality, if I might speak with your brother. Cynthia's hands froze mid-fold. He's not here, she said after a pause. He left for London yesterday. Work. Odd, Miss Marple replied. The librarian said he'd reserved another book in the same series as The Woman Who Died on a Tuesday, due for collection this afternoon. Cynthia's eyes narrowed slightly. He must have forgotten to cancel. Miss Marple stepped closer, gently. He was in Florence recently, wasn't he? Cynthia hesitated, briefly. A job fell through. Did he know Mrs. Harper? No. Cynthia said too quickly. At least, not well. I mean, she was just the old lady in the village. We all knew of her. Miss Marple gave a slight nod, letting silence stretch just enough for discomfort. Then, without changing tone, she asked, "And did you mention to him that you cleaned for her?" "Yes, I suppose I did." "You never saw them speak?" "No. Yet you told me he never met her." He never said he did, I just assumed." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Assumptions can be dangerous, my dear, especially when they concern the dead." She left before Cynthia could reply, choosing not to push further. The truth was better coaxed than cornered. Her next stop was to visit young Georgie Tavers, the milkman who had found the body. He lived with his mother in a small flat above the bakery, always cheerful, always chatty. He greeted Miss Marple with enthusiasm, clearly proud that someone from the village still thought his discovery noteworthy. "She was always kind to me. Mrs. Harper," he said earnestly, "gave me a biscuit most mornings, said it helped keep me from falling off the cart." "You found the door ajar?" "Yes, ma'am. Thought it was strange. She always kept things shut tight." "Did you see anyone else that morning, near the cottage?" Georgie scratched his head. "Now that you mention it, I saw a man walking up the lane. Didn't think much of it at the time. Bit too nicely dressed for the weather. Thin fellow, carrying a small leather case, like a music teacher's maybe." "Did he go to the cottage?" "No, just passed by. But I only saw him for a second. I turned back after knocking, and he was further up already." Miss Marple thanked him and walked away slowly. A thin man. A case. Perhaps something as harmless as a solicitor or something more precise. Someone carrying documents or even medicine. But Georgie's mention confirmed what she had already begun to suspect. Paul Redford had visited the village, likely that very morning, and no one had acknowledged it. Back at Rose Cottage, she requested access once more under the pretense of retrieving a misplaced scarf. Constable Rowley, grumbling, gave her 10 minutes. Inside, she ignored the scarf entirely and went instead to the umbrella stand. Among the walking sticks and worn parasols was something newer. A polished, black-handled umbrella with initials faintly scratched near the crook. PR tucked within its folds was a small folded paper, a train ticket from Eastbourne to Paddington, dated Tuesday morning. No return. She replaced the umbrella just as Constable Rowley called her out. That night, Miss Marple sat in her parlour, staring at the half-finished letter again. You must understand that Tuesday, it had been meant as a confession, or a warning. And the more she considered it, the more she began to think the victim had been prepared. She'd known something, anticipated something. She sent a note to the Redfords early the next day, requesting to speak with Paul. She knew the reply would claim he was unavailable, but she also knew someone else would answer for him. Sure enough, Cynthia appeared at her door later that afternoon. "You're wasting your time," she said coldly. "Paul's gone. Whatever fantasy you're building, you have no proof." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Proof? Not yet. But stories shift when too many tell them. And your story, my dear, has shifted more than once." Cynthia's expression hardened. "You think I helped him do something?" Miss Marple didn't answer directly. "I think your brother knew something. About the war, perhaps. About your past. Or Mrs. Harper's. Something that frightened her. Something she intended to reveal." "You're wrong." "Am I?" Miss Marple looked steadily at her. "Mrs. Harper knew a secret. She wrote it down. Perhaps not in that letter, but somewhere. And when she died, someone thought the secret had died with her. But secrets like that never vanish. They linger in drawers, in half-read books, in the memories of those who cannot forget." Cynthia said nothing, but her silence was heavier than denial. The web had begun to quiver just faintly, but Miss Marple knew it was tightening. Lies were being told, each one carefully chosen, but the contradictions were beginning to show. Paul Redford had returned, not just to visit his sister, but to silence a truth long buried. And Miss Marple would find it, one thread at a time. Rain tapped gently against the windows of Miss Marple's sitting room as she sat before the fire, her thoughts weaving through the tangled maze that had formed around Cecilia Harper's death. It was no longer a question of if foul play had occurred. It was now a matter of why and how, and more pressingly, who. She reviewed every detail in silence, each inconsistency carefully folded into memory. A missing letter from Florence, a brother's sudden return, a fictional murder echoing real life, a dry pen in a dead woman's hand, and a Tuesday missed after decades of devotion. She began assembling the web. First, Paul Redford, the shadow that slipped through the village just before Cecilia Harper died. No official record of his visit, but evidence was stacking. Georgie's sighting, the umbrella with initials, the train ticket, the novel borrowed under his name. Then there was Cynthia, whose story shifted too easily. Her role in the house placed her in the center of the scene both before and after. Yet Miss Marple sensed Cynthia was not driving the event, only protecting someone who was. The motive, however, remained elusive. She needed more than hunches. So she arranged with quiet efficiency a gathering. The vicar offered the church, hall, and the pretext was harmless enough. A small tea circle to remember Mrs. Harper, to which key villagers were subtly encouraged to attend. Miss Marple's keen eyes swept the room as she poured tea with a smile. Cynthia sat stiffly near the door, avoiding prolonged eye contact. Georgie Tavers fidgeted with his biscuit. Mr. Sneed, the librarian, busied himself with cream buns. And a quiet, narrow-faced man lingered at the edge, introduced as Mr. Colin Arkwell, the solicitor who had managed Mrs. Harper's modest estate. A man no one had mentioned until now. Miss Marple approached him gently, asking after any recent amendments to Mrs. Harper's will. He seemed surprised but answered obligingly. She made a change 3 weeks ago, very minor, mostly bequeathing her book collection to the village library. The rest remained the same. Her estate to her sister. Lillian, a few trinkets to the church, nothing controversial. No new beneficiaries? Miss Marple asked. No, none. Though she did inquire about transferring a sum to someone in Florence. It never materialized. She said she'd follow up. That caught Miss Marple's attention. Did she mention the recipient's name? She didn't. Only that it was someone she hadn't spoken to in years. Someone who might not welcome it. The room grew fainter around her as the phrase turned over in her mind. Someone she hadn't spoken to. Someone who might not welcome it. There was history buried here, a knot of the cheerful, reconciliatory sort. After the gathering, she returned home and opened the borrowed copy of The Woman Who Died on a Tuesday once more. A key passage near the end suddenly clicked into place. She had thought silence meant peace, but the past waited patiently behind the door. Until the day she reached for the latch. That line buried in fiction read now like a warning. The book hadn't been chosen at random. It was a mirror. The next morning she made her way to East Whitlow, a short bus ride through mist-laced hedgerows. Lillian Brooks received her in a house heavy with gloom. Cecilia's death had worn her visibly thin. She was troubled, you know, Lillian said, folding her hands tightly in her lap. Something had been weighing on her. She wouldn't say what, just that she'd been foolish during the war. Trusted the wrong person, made a decision she regretted. Did she ever mention the name Paul Redford? Lillian flinched. No. But she did say she feared someone from the past might resurface, someone who might not forgive what she'd done. Miss Marple paused, letting that settle. Was she involved with anyone during the war? Outside the village? Lillian hesitated. There was a man. A liaison of sorts. Brief. She never said much, only that he disappeared under terrible circumstances. She believed he'd been betrayed. She always carried guilt about it. Could he have survived? I don't know. But she kept a photograph hidden in her drawer. I found it after she died. Him in uniform. It was missing when I went back later. Miss Marple's fingers twitched. A photo. Possibly the same one from Rose Cottage's mantelpiece, though she remembered that one bearing damage. A thumbprint. Across the face. Perhaps someone had removed it from her belongings to ensure no one else identified the man. She thanked Lillian and returned to St. Mary Mead with a heavier suspicion. Cecilia Harper had once been entangled with someone in the war. Likely Paul Redford under another name. A betrayal occurred. She had lived with remorse. And now, when she'd tried to right that wrong, by sending money, perhaps by preparing to confess, he had come to silence her. The motive no longer felt abstract. It was personal. Revenge, wrapped in fear. But other threads remained. Why had Cynthia lied? Was it just sibling loyalty or something more? She paid a second visit to Cynthia that afternoon. This time, she came not as an old woman with questions, but as someone who had seen too much and was ready to name it. I believe your brother came here under a different name during the war, she said quietly. That he disappeared under disgrace, that Mrs. Harper knew him then, perhaps unwittingly, and her silence aided his escape. But when she realized who he had become, she was prepared to speak. Cynthia's composure cracked. She was going to expose him. Because she had reason to believe she helped a traitor. And your brother, he could not allow that. But you cleaned the house that week. You found the letter. You saw what she wrote. You warned him. Cynthia turned away, her voice brittle. I didn't know what he'd do. I thought Just confront her. Maybe scare her. But then he came back pale and shaking, said it was handled. I asked what that meant, and he said, she won't talk about Tuesday anymore. I didn't know she was dead, not then. Miss Marple rose. You do realize withholding this makes you complicit? I do now, Cynthia whispered. That evening, Miss Marple drafted a letter to Inspector Cray at the county office, enclosing everything: observations, witness contradictions, the umbrella, the book reservation, the missing photograph, the altered will, the motive. She did not accuse directly. She didn't have to. She simply laid the maze out piece by piece. Every suspect had reason to act. Cynthia, out of guilt and misguided loyalty. Paul, out of fear and revenge. Even Mrs. Harper, in her quiet way, had tried to atone. And in doing so, she had pulled all the hidden threads to the surface. Now it was only a matter of time before the whole web collapsed. 2 days after Miss Marple's letter reached Inspector Cray, the official machinery of justice lurched into motion. The inspector, a neat man with an impatience for ambiguity, arrived in St. Mary Mead by motorcar, and within hours summoned Cynthia Redford for questioning. The town, as always, was quick to respond with murmurs and sideways glances. Constable Rowley stood a little straighter. The vicar's wife made 2 extra batches of scones, and Miss Marple, having lived through enough of these performances, waited quietly as the scene unfolded. Cynthia was seen leaving the station late in the afternoon, pale and tight-lipped. News travelled swiftly that she had admitted to warning her brother of Mrs. Harper's intentions. The discarded umbrella had been recovered, and the ticket confirmed Paul's presence in the village on the very day Cecilia died. It all fit, at least well enough for Inspector Cray. By the next morning, a formal statement was issued. The unfortunate death of Mrs. Harper has been linked to external pressure from a known associate, Paul Redford, whose whereabouts are being pursued by the authorities. There is at this time no indication of further foul play. The village exhaled. The milkman returned to his usual route. The librarian reorganized the war memoir shelf. Constable Rowley polished his boots. To most, it was a closed case, a troubled woman, blackmailed perhaps, pushed too far by an old ghost. Paul Redford was cast as the obvious villain, lurking now in some foreign corner. But to Miss Marple, the resolution felt thin, unfinished, far too convenient. Her instinct, fine-tuned by decades of quiet observation, told her this was not a story that ended with escape. It was one where something, or someone, remained behind. She returned to Rose Cottage once more, this time not seeking new evidence, but re-evaluating what had already been found. The writing desk still bore the unfinished letter, untouched since the day of the death. You must understand that Tuesday. It no longer seemed a confession, but perhaps a warning, interrupted. Miss Marple traced her finger along the rim of the inkwell. Dry. The pen, dry. The scene, frozen. The constable and the coroner had both accepted the illusion, a sudden death at the desk. But had she truly died there? In the kitchen, the kettle was out of place, moved slightly back on the counter. The teacup had shattered by the entry, not by the desk. Why make tea and write simultaneously, in separate rooms? Miss Marple walked the path between the two. Something was wrong with the sequence. If Cecilia had been interrupted mid-tea, Why return to the desk at all? Why leave the oven on? She hadn't. Miss Marple stood very still. Someone had arranged it. If Mrs. Harper had collapsed in the kitchen, why move her to the parlor? Why pose her hand over the pen? Only someone who wanted to suggest a natural death in the midst of routine. Someone who had time. Someone who knew what would and would not be examined. Later that evening she took her questions to Georgie Tavers again, this time less as an inquisitor and more as a quiet confidant. That morning, she asked, before you reached the door, did you hear anything unusual? Any voices, movement? Georgie shook his head, then paused. Actually, now you say it, I thought I heard the gate clink, like someone left just before I arrived. But I didn't see anyone. Did it sound hurried? No, just casual, like someone leaving after a visit. Miss Marple thanked him, the pieces slowly turning. The authorities had focused on Paul Redford because he fit the frame too well. A convenient villain, conveniently gone. But if he'd only intended to confront her, and he'd left before the body was found. Someone else had been inside after, someone who stayed, someone who made the scene what it became. The next morning, she made her way to the library, drawn, not by curiosity, but by certainty. Mr. Sneed, the librarian, looked up from behind his desk, startled by her sudden appearance. Miss Marple, he said, I heard the Redford matters being handled. Terrible business. Quite, she replied. I've come to return that novel, the one Mrs. Harper borrowed before her death. Mr. Sneed reached for the ledger. Yes, I remember it. Odd how life imitates fiction, or fiction guides life, she said absently. You know, I found it fascinating that both she and your last borrower, Paul, chose that exact book. Was it particularly popular? Sneed looked vaguely uncomfortable. Not really, bit obscure. And yet two readers, both closely tied to this mystery, chose it within a week of each other. She let the silence stretch. You were the one who recommended it to her, weren't you? His lips parted slightly, then closed. I might have mentioned it. She asked for something clever, and I thought, well, she liked puzzles. Of course, Miss Marple said gently. And you visited her from time to time, didn't you? She mentioned as much at the garden fete, said she appreciated your insight into her reading. He hesitated too long. You told the inspector you hadn't seen her in months. Mr. Sneed's hands tightened around the edge of the desk. I didn't think it mattered. But it did, she said. You knew her well enough to enter her home without alarm, to be invited in. Possibly even to arrive after Paul left. You found her alone, agitated. Perhaps she told you what she planned to do, report her past mistake. Perhaps she mentioned your name, your involvement. He rose from the desk. That's ridiculous. Not if she recognized you from the war. Not if she remembered what you'd done. You have no idea what she was capable of. On the contrary, Miss Marple replied, I believe she was capable of guilt, of remorse, of attempting to put things right before it was too late. But you... Mr. Sneed's voice dropped to a whisper. She was going to ruin everything, over something that happened decades ago. You smoothed the scene, Miss Marple said quietly. You moved the body. You placed the pen. You took the letter. You thought if Paul was blamed, it would never come back to you. But Mr. Sneed said nothing. He sat back down, pale and silent, the edges of panic spreading across his face. The mask had slipped. That evening, Miss Marple penned another letter, this one to Inspector Cray. She made no grand declarations, no accusations. She merely presented facts, the inconsistencies in the death scene, the forgotten relationships, the library logs, and a quiet man whose role had been overlooked because he never stood in the spotlight. The authorities had their false victory. But the real villain had remained in the shadows, unnoticed. Until now. Miss Marple sat by her window late into the evening, her knitting untouched in her lap as the final pieces of the puzzle drifted into sharper focus. Outside, the village moved with the quiet rhythm of routine, unaware of the deep current, running beneath the surface of its well-trimmed hedges and flowered lanes. The case, according to the wider world, was resolved. Cynthia Redford's confession had settled the narrative, and the authorities were content to pursue Paul abroad. But Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime listening more carefully than most, sensed that they had only swept dust from the visible floor. The real matter remained in the forgotten corners. The conversation with Mr. Sneed had left an echo in her mind. His words had not simply revealed guilt. They hinted at something older, deeper. "You have no idea what she was capable of," he'd said. "Not what she did, but what she was." It suggested more than blackmail. It suggested shared history. Miss Marple turned that idea over in her mind. What had Cecilia Harper done? Not just to Paul Redford or Mr. Sneed, but during those shadowed years of war when the village was a very different place. She returned to East Whitlow the next morning under the pretense of checking on Lillian Brooks, but her purpose was more exact. Lillian welcomed her in with tired warmth, still burdened by the recent days. "It's been such a strain," she confessed. The inspector called again, asking if Cecilia ever mentioned names. "I told him the same. I don't remember any." Miss Marple nodded gently, then asked, "Do you recall anyone unusual visiting Cecilia during the war? A lodger, perhaps, or someone she worked with?" Lillian hesitated. "We both worked part-time at the hall back then. They'd converted it for administrative use, war records mostly. We weren't told much, just typing, filing, that sort of thing." "Did Mr. Sneed work there too?" "Yes, but not in the same office. He was brought in after a breach in one of the coding sections. Very hush-hush. Cecilia avoided him after that. Said he gave her a bad feeling." That quiet phrase tightened everything. A breach in a coding section during wartime meant espionage, or worse, and someone had kept quiet about it. Miss Marple returned to St. Mary Mead with renewed clarity and paid a visit to the parish archive, a small room behind the church filled with brittle ledgers and brittle memories. With a little help from the vicar, she found what she was looking for: a list of village names who'd served in civilian capacities during the war. Under Communications and Civil Defense, St. Edmund's Hall, she found them: Cecilia Harper, Lillian Brooks, Edward Sneed, and further down, a lightly penciled entry: Peter Redford, temporary post, security cleared. Peter, not Paul, the name in the photograph. The man Cecilia had loved, and perhaps helped unwittingly. A traitor shielded under another identity. And Edward Sneed, brought in after the breach, likely tasked with internal inquiries. That was the buried connection. Sneed hadn't simply known Cecilia from book chats and library finds. He had known her as a link in a chain of wartime failure. She had seen him in his other role, as an investigator, perhaps a man complicit in covering the truth for stability's sake. Miss Marple now understood the shape of it. Cecilia Harper had, in her final weeks, resolved to make things right, not just morally, but legally. A letter to Florence. A request to her solicitor to arrange a payment, perhaps to a descendant of the man she believed she had betrayed, but her effort to reach back into the past had triggered panic in those who had depended on silence. Sneed had been waiting, watching. And when Redford's appearance, however brief, threatened to bring it all crashing down, he acted. She returned to the library once more, the air around Mr. Sneed heavy with tension. He greeted her without enthusiasm. "Miss Marple," he said carefully, "I assume you've come to gloat." "Not at all," she replied calmly. "Only to ask you why you did not say that you knew Mrs. Harper from the war." His hands froze over a stack of return books. "It's ancient history. Not if people are still dying because of it." He didn't respond. "You investigated her once, didn't you?" she continued, or tried to. "You suspected she had helped a man escape. A man named Peter Redford." "Peter was a traitor," Sneed said quietly. "He passed code to the enemy. Men died because of him. And you believe she knew. She wasn't stupid," he said, the words cold now. "She was infatuated, protected him, lied to cover for him, and then she vanished into quiet domesticity. No justice, no consequence, just rose gardens and tea, until she decided for some noble reason to reopen it all. She tried to make peace," Miss Marple replied. "She tried to martyr herself," he spat. "And if she dragged the rest of us into the light while doing it, what then? Trials, public shame. You don't understand, Miss Marple. The war never ended for some of us." There it was, the final confession. Not of murder with malice, but of a life shaped by silence and regret. He had not killed Cecilia out of rage or greed, but out of fear. Fear that the ghosts of those war years would finally rise and ruin the fragile illusion of peace he had built around himself. "You moved her body," she said softly, "made it look natural." "She was already gone," he replied. "Collapsed, I think. Maybe the stress was too much. I just finished the scene, removed the letter, made sure it ended quietly." "But you didn't account for the novel," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but firm. "Or the borrowed ticket. Or the memories others still held." He looked at her, then the fury gone, leaving only hollowness. "So now what?" "I've already sent everything to Inspector Cray," she said, rising. "He'll be here in the morning." As she stepped outside, the air was cold and clean. The past had not died with Peter Redford or Cecilia Harper. It had waited, tucked in library shelves, in ink-stained paper, in whispered names on old war ledgers. But now the web was broken, and the truth at last had risen from its hiding place. The next morning arrived with a heavy mist clinging low to the village lanes, giving the rooftops of St. Mary Mead a ghostly, muffled appearance. At precisely 10 minutes past 9, Miss Marple arrived at the library carrying a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. Her step was deliberate, unhurried, and her expression gave nothing away. Mr. Sneed, seated behind his desk as usual, looked up as she entered. There was no greeting this time, only a watchful stillness in his eyes, as though he had spent the night rehearsing a defense he wasn't sure he'd need. "I've brought you something," Miss Marple said lightly, placing the bundle on the counter. She undid the string with fingers as steady as if she were unwrapping a scone tin at a parish picnic. Inside lay a worn but intact copy of A Quiet Betrayal. Another wartime novel, not particularly popular but distinct in one way. Its main character bore a clear resemblance to a thinly disguised version of a real wartime official. A man who failed to report treason within his department. A man who justified it by claiming it had spared greater embarrassment to the government. I thought, "You might enjoy it," she said, pushing the book toward him. "There's a character in there that reminded me so much of you. Clever, soft-spoken, always watching from the corner of the room. Though I confess I never trusted him from the very first page." Sneed gave a thin smile. "I've never read it, no." Her tone was light, but her eyes stayed steady. Odd. Mrs. Harper had. She borrowed it just before she changed her will. I always wondered if it reminded her of anyone. He stiffened almost imperceptibly. I'm sure she found comparisons where there were none. Perhaps, Miss Marple mused, stepping back from the counter. But the mind does strange things when confronted with fiction, don't you think? It rearranges reality to fit the narrative, sometimes to comfort itself, sometimes to justify an action it's already taken. Silence followed, long and tight. Then Sneed reached forward and closed the book with a deliberate thump. "Is this supposed to mean something?" "Oh, not to you," she replied, reaching into her handbag now. "But I did bring one more thing. An envelope. Rather ordinary, really. Except for the ink. Violet. With a scent of lavender. Quite a unique combination. You see, I've found where it came from." His breath hitched, just faintly. Thought for some time it might have been Paul or Peter Redford's stationery. But no, it was purchased here, in the village, not in Florence at all. She laid the envelope on the counter. "From the same shop where you buy your paper for those charming library notices. You do them by hand, don't you? With that elegant, slanted script, quite distinctive." He stared at her, the line of his jaw twitching as though clenching a storm behind his teeth. Then he spoke with a slow coldness. "So I sent her a letter, and perhaps I scented it, and perhaps I hoped she'd read between the lines. Does that make me a killer?" "Not directly, perhaps," she said, "but when she didn't respond, you came. Not to follow up, but to stop her." "You have no proof," he said, barely above a whisper. "Not the kind you fear. But tell me something, Mr. Sneed. Why did you take the woman who died on a Tuesday off the shelf yesterday morning, after it had already been logged as returned?" His eyes flicked up. "I checked the library log. You removed it before I arrived. Perhaps hoping I wouldn't see it again, or perhaps simply uneasy about what it might still reveal." Sneed rose from his chair, fingers tight against the desk. "You think fiction is evidence?" "I think it was your rehearsal," Miss Marple said gently. "Your confession, written by someone else. A safe place to test how it would feel. But it didn't give you peace. It never does, you know. Fiction can only pretend to close things. Life always demands its own ending." The door behind them opened with a soft creak. Inspector Cray stepped in, nodding slightly toward Miss Marple before facing the librarian. "Mr. Sneed," he said, voice clipped. "We've received a formal statement corroborating Miss Marple's findings. You're requested to come with us for further questioning." Sneed didn't move. His shoulders sagged, not from shock, but as if a weight he had carried for years had shifted at last into full view. "She didn't even hate me," he said quietly. "That's what made it worse. She wanted to forgive me, and I couldn't stand it." He left with the inspector, not resisting, not speaking again. Only Miss Marple remained in the quiet room, the book still resting on the counter, its cover slightly warped at the corners. She picked it up, glanced at the blurb once more, then placed it gently back on the return shelf. Outside, the fog had begun to lift, and the lanes of St. Mary Mead returned to the light, unknowing of the final story that had unfolded behind the librarian's desk. But Miss Marple knew, and she had never trusted that character from the very first page. By the following morning, the village's calm exterior began to ripple under the weight of quiet rumor. Word of Mr. Sneed's sudden detainment spread from the butcher's to the bakery in the span of an hour. It wasn't shouted, it was murmured, carried with that peculiar blend of curiosity and caution that St. Mary Mead had perfected over generations. Miss Marple, having been seen speaking with the inspector and present at the library just before the arrest, was now viewed with a mix of admiration and unease, as though she had pulled a mask from someone too familiar. But even as the dust of Sneed's unravelling settled, Miss Marple's mind had not yet rested. She found herself once again in her parlour by mid-morning, flipping through her notes, mentally cataloguing every detail. The letter with the lavender scent had not simply been a taunt, it had been a controlled warning, an attempt to rattle Cecilia Harper before things spun out of hand. That same control had shaped the crime scene, manipulated timelines, and nearly convinced everyone of a tidy conclusion, but it wasn't tidy. There was still something she couldn't align. The missing letter from Florence. Inspector Cray had, to his credit, taken her suspicions seriously. He had begun to review the evidence with renewed scrutiny, ordering another search of Rose Cottage, this time under his own eye. Miss Marple had not accompanied them, but she was informed that the writing desk had been emptied and catalogued again. No foreign correspondence had been found. No envelope, no address, no paper, no trace. It was gone. By late afternoon, Cray arrived at her cottage, not with satisfaction, but irritation lightly pressed beneath his otherwise polite manner. "We've reviewed the scene thoroughly. No sign of the letter. The cleaner never saw it again, and we've no grounds to search any further without new direction." Miss Marple listened carefully. "Have you checked the fireplace? The chimney?" "Clean. It was swept last week according to the logs. Not so much as a burnt scrap." "And Mrs. Harper's handbag?" "Contained nothing beyond a few shillings. Her spectacles and a peppermint lozenge." Miss Marple sat back, brow gently furrowed. "It hasn't vanished," she said. "It's been hidden. Or more likely, removed. By Sneed. Perhaps. But if so, he would have destroyed it. Instead, I suspect someone else got to it before he could. Someone we overlooked." Cray frowned. "You mean Cynthia?" Miss Marple didn't answer directly. She had begun to see the outline of something larger, a second hand reaching in behind the curtain. Sneed had tried to control the damage, but he hadn't acted alone. Not in thought. Perhaps not even in action. She remembered Georgie's words, the sound of a gate, someone leaving, not hurried, not panicked, composed. That evening Miss Marple visited Rose Cottage herself. The constable on duty allowed her a few minutes, and she walked through the familiar rooms with a precise stillness. The writing desk was now bare, but the drawer runners bore faint traces of where folders had been removed. Not just one or two, many. She looked to the bookshelf, which remained mostly untouched, save for a single thin space between two gardening volumes, a gap wide enough to fit a small notebook. She tilted her head. Someone had taken the records, not all at once, not violently, but systematically. She returned to the sitting room, studying the armchair by the window. There was a cushion that had been recently plumped, unlike the others, which still bore the shape of long-settled use. She gently lifted the cushion. Beneath it was a faint outline in the upholstery, a rectangle, slightly worn, the size of a book or a diary. But there was nothing there now. Outside, the mist had returned, curling. Through the yew hedges, Miss Marple turned back to the constable. "Was anyone else permitted entry before you were posted?" He hesitated. "Only Miss Redford. She asked to collect a few belongings. Said she left a cardigan." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "Did she leave with anything?" "A small parcel, wrapped. I assumed it was the cardigan." But Miss Marple already knew it wasn't. Cynthia had taken something else, something far more valuable than wool and buttons. She went directly to Cynthia's cottage under the soft cover of dusk. Cynthia answered the door more composed than one might expect, not rattled, not even defensive. "I've just come from Rose Cottage," Miss Marple said gently. Cynthia said nothing, her fingers tightening on the doorknob. "I believe you took something from under the cushion. Something you didn't want the police to find." A pause, and then, with surprising honesty, Cynthia stepped aside. "Come in." Miss Marple followed her into the small front room. On the mantelpiece, among neatly framed photos, was a wooden box, nothing ornate, just enough to be discreet. Cynthia opened it and withdrew a folded letter, worn at the edges. "I didn't destroy it," she said. "I couldn't. But I also couldn't hand it over." Miss Marple unfolded the letter carefully. The handwriting was Cecilia's. The language was unmistakable. It wasn't a confession, it was a memory of Peter Redford, of the night she spent wondering if her silence had damned him. It wasn't a name she'd hidden. It was a child. She had a son. Miss Marple whispered. "My half-brother," Cynthia said quietly. "She told me just after my mother died. Said she had given him up during the war, and now she wanted to find him again, to make amends." Miss Marple let the silence breathe, the implications settling. Peter, wasn't the father. No. But he knew. He used it against her. Threatened to tell. Said it would disgrace the family name. She didn't care anymore. But someone else did. "You?" Miss Marple asked. But there was no judgment in the question. "I wanted to protect her," Cynthia said. "I wanted to stop Paul, yes, but I didn't know what Mr. Sneed would do." She said he was watching her again, after all those years. Miss Marple refolded the letter and returned it to the box. "You must give this to Inspector Cray." "I will," Cynthia said softly. "But I needed you to see it first. To understand. My mother was never the same after the war. Now I know why." Outside, the rain had begun to fall. The evidence had nearly vanished, nearly been swept into memory like so much of the past. But someone had cared enough to keep it, not for protection, but for truth. The web wasn't undone, yet, but its strands were exposed. And in the fragile space between guilt and love, trust could begin again, if only barely. The next morning broke unnaturally quiet. Even the birds seemed subdued, the grey sky pressed low over St. Mary Mead, as though warning of something yet to come. Miss Marple sat in her breakfast nook, the remnants of her tea untouched. The letter, from Cecilia Harper, now safely in Inspector Cray's possession, had opened a new corridor into the past, one that rewrote everything previously assumed. A child lost to wartime secrecy, a blackmailer from the shadows. And Cynthia, caught between blood and betrayal, had become something more complex than a bystander. But the case, while tangled, had begun to unfold with clarity. Or so it seemed. It was just past 8 when the knock came. Firm, urgent. "Miss." Marple opened the door to find Constable Rowley pale and breathless, his cap askew and voice clipped with disbelief. "It's Mrs. Redford," he said. "You'd better come." She followed him down the narrow lane without a word, her steps steady though her chest grew tighter with each turn. They reached Cynthia's cottage. The door hung ajar. Inside, the air was thick with unease. The constable stepped aside as she entered. The front room was undisturbed, neat, almost too neat, but the calm was a facade. Cynthia was gone. Her handbag still rested on the table, her coat hung on the rack, and the wooden box where the letter had been stored was open and empty. No sign of struggle, no shattered glass. Only the scent of lavender lingered faintly in the air, as if the past had reached in again and taken something back. Inspector Cray arrived minutes later, his expression sharp and restless. "She didn't show for our meeting," he said grimly. "I came to check and found this." Miss Marple stood near the writing table, eyes fixed on a small smear of ink near the open box, fresh, curved as though a finger had pressed too hard on the lid before closing it. "The letter is gone again," she said. Cray nodded. "We've sent word to check the train stations. It's possible she fled, but I doubt it. Something's off." Miss Marple didn't answer. Her mind was already moving. Cynthia hadn't fled. She had no reason to. The truth was already laid bare. She had come forward willingly. The only person left who stood to lose something now was the same one who had acted in darkness before. Someone who knew exactly how close they were to being found out. Outside, the fog had lifted slightly, revealing the familiar curves of hedgerows and stone walls, but nothing familiar comforted Miss Marple anymore. The past, she realized, was still shifting. The murder of Cecilia Harper had never been a single crime. It had been a rupture, a wound, torn open after decades of silence. And now, someone was trying to stitch it closed again with fear. She walked back to her cottage in silence, Inspector Cray staying behind to coordinate the search. But as she turned the corner, her steps slowed. A car sat parked in the lane, an unfamiliar model, dark green, with no village dust on the tires. She approached cautiously. The window was down. No driver inside. A satchel lay on the front seat embossed with faint initials. PR. Her heart leapt, not with fear but with certainty. Paul, or rather, Peter Redford, had returned. She hurried to Cray's temporary command post near the chapel and told him what she'd seen. Together they returned to the lane, but the car was gone. Tire tracks led back toward the main road. Cray swore under his breath. He was watching. He may still be, Miss Marple said quietly. And if he's taken Cynthia, it's because she's the last thread he needs to cut. The question was where he would take her. Not far, she guessed. Peter Redford had survived by being careful, by calculating every move. He wouldn't risk open roads or train stations. He would want somewhere familiar, somewhere forgotten. That evening, Miss Marple found herself standing once more outside Rose Cottage. It had been sealed by the police, the gate chained, but she spoke to the constable on duty, and persuaded him with a gentle appeal to logic. "If he's come back," she said, "he won't go anywhere unfamiliar. He'll return to where it began." Inside, the house was still and cold, but she moved quickly now, no longer uncertain. She checked the back rooms, the larder, the shed behind the garden wall. Nothing. But in the cellar, beneath the wooden trapdoor by the pantry, something had changed. A faint scuff on the floor, a smell that hadn't been there before, earth and dampness, mingled with something faintly metallic. She called for Cray, who arrived within 10 minutes, and opened the hatch with caution. A short staircase led down. The beam of his torch swept across the cellar. In the corner, slumped but alive, was Cynthia, her wrists bound, her face pale but alert. She blinked up into the light. "He didn't want to kill me," she said hoarsely. "Not at first. He just wanted the letter. Said it was the last thing tying him to the past." Cray moved quickly, untying her. "Where is he now?" "Gone," she whispered. "He said he was going to end it properly," said the detective. Miss Marple knew too much. They turned to find her, but Miss Marple had already moved. She walked back upstairs into the front parlor, her heart measured but her senses alert. The house was still, but she felt it. Someone watching. From outside, from the shadows. The door creaked open. He stood there. Older, thinner, but unmistakably. The man from the photograph that had once sat on the mantelpiece. Peter Redford. His coat was dusted with leaves. His eyes were calm, calculating. Not wild, not frantic. Just resolved. "You've meddled far too deeply," he said softly. "And yet not enough," Miss Marple replied, her voice clear. "You waited too long, Mr. Redford. The truth moved faster than you thought." He stepped inside, the door closing. Behind him for a moment the room felt frozen, two histories meeting in silence. But before he could speak again, Cray entered from the kitchen, with his revolver drawn. "It's over," the inspector said. Peter Redford didn't fight. He simply looked at Miss Marple, as though trying to measure the exact point, where everything had slipped from his hands. "I should have ended it with her," he said. "But she ended it herself," Miss Marple replied, "by choosing truth over fear." They led him out in silence. Cynthia, weak but unbroken, watched from the stairwell. Outside, the village carried on as it always had. Pots boiled, clocks ticked, and gardens whispered in the breeze. But for the second time in as many weeks, a man had come to bury the past. And for the second time, Miss Marple had brought it to light. The danger had never left. It had only been waiting. But now, it had a face. The air in St. Mary Mead remained, heavy even after Peter Redford was taken away, as though the village itself had yet to breathe out the tension that had settled like mist over every hedge and thatched rooftop. Miss Marple sat alone in her drawing room, the firelight casting quiet shadows against the floral wallpaper, her eyes not on her knitting, but on the space just above it, gazing, but not idle. The pieces of the case had scattered and collided, some with great noise, others with silence, but now, as the storm's force abated, she sensed something deeper beneath it all, a thread not yet tied. Cynthia had been taken, then found. The letter had disappeared, then returned to the inspector's hands. Peter Redford had been arrested, and with him the last obvious threat. And yet something clung to her thoughts, an unsettled loop that would not close. The facts aligned. The motives stood clear. But she could not dismiss the sense that something vital had remained unseen because it had always been visible. She went back through her notes, penciled in her small, looping hand, retracing the beginning. Cecilia Harper slumped at her desk, an unfinished letter, the pen dry, the toast burnt, the door ajar. Those early details now carried different meanings, reinterpreted through the lens of what had followed. But one detail, long overlooked, pulled at her with new insistence. The letter Cecilia had begun had ended mid-sentence. You must understand that Tuesday. Everyone had assumed that the letter's meaning was emotional, an intention to confess. But Miss Marple, having read thousands of people across decades, knew that confessions did not stop at day names. They explained, they qualified, they circled the truth before breaking it. This sentence, cut short by death, wasn't the start of a confession. It was the conclusion of something already in progress. A conversation, perhaps, or more curiously, a pattern. She walked to her bureau and took out the copy of the ledger Cray had allowed her to photograph, Cecilia's library, borrowing history. Not just the woman who died on a Tuesday, but half a dozen titles that preceded it over the course of 2 months. War novels, spy thrillers, and one peculiar entry, The Man Who Came on Wednesdays. A slow chill settled over her. She scanned the list again. A Thursday vow, Friday in Florence, The Lie on Saturday, The Widow on Monday. Each one, a date. Each one borrowed in succession, and then The Woman Who Died on a Tuesday. She realized with sudden and perfect clarity that Cecilia Harper hadn't been choosing those books for idle pleasure. She had been reading them in order, tracking something or someone. Miss Marple fetched her handbag and shawl and set off into the night. She arrived at the vicarage just after 8 and asked to see the church's volunteer logbooks. The vicar's wife, still shaken from recent events but always polite, offered them up with a weak smile. Do forgive the mess. I've only just returned them to order. Miss Marple flipped through the weekly duty rosters. There it was. Edward Sneed, signed in for archival sorting each Wednesday for nearly 10 months. Peter Redford, or Paul as he'd been known, had visited on Thursdays. Cynthia came on Fridays, Cecilia on Mondays. Every day had its place, but the Tuesdays, there were gaps, missing signatures, inconsistent visitors, or in some weeks, no visitors at all. She moved to the second log, the library's internal schedule. Mr. Sneed on Wednesdays and Saturdays, Cecilia Harper on Mondays. But a note on one entry from 2 months ago caught her eye. Tuesday, special delivery, handled by volunteer. No name, just initials. CR. She froze. Cynthia Redford. But that wasn't right. Cynthia had always claimed she only worked Thursdays, and yet there it was, a quiet correction, a reassignment she hadn't mentioned. Miss Marple left the vicarage in silence, her mind whirring. The pattern was not just in the books or the letters, it was in the movements, the rhythm of the village. Everyone had their habits, their appointed days. And Cecilia had built her days around observation, around finding the anomaly. Someone had been altering routines, shifting roles to create proximity, appearing when others did not expect them. She went straight to Inspector Cray's temporary office and requested the official log of visitors to Rose Cottage in the weeks prior to the death. One entry, listed by the local post service, caught her attention. A carrier from Florence had arrived with a parcel, but the signature collected wasn't Cecilia Harper's, it was signed by C.R. Cray frowned. That confirms Cynthia took it. Miss Marple shook her head. It confirmed someone wanted us to believe she did. She thought again of the lavender scent. Not in the letter, but in the room itself. It had lingered more in the parlor than anywhere else. But Cynthia had only retrieved something from the sitting room, never gone farther in. And then the oddest recollection struck her. The bookend in Cecilia's library had been turned upside down. Only one. She returned to the library the next morning and checked. The same bookend remained reversed, and on its base, faint but still legible, a library stamp, property of St. Edmund's Hall. She had seen another identical one months ago at the desk of the librarian. Mr. Sneed had kept a pair, and now there was only one. Miss Marple stood very still, and everything fell into place. The real pattern wasn't in the crimes, but in the deception. Someone had not simply murdered to silence. A truth, they had built the appearance of multiple suspects, sown confusion through repetition and impersonation. They had slipped between the days of the week like a shadow, always present but never noticed. Edward Sneed had not acted alone, and Peter Redford had not acted first. Someone else, methodical, quiet, practiced, had set the board from the beginning, and in that moment Miss Marple knew who had been visiting on Tuesdays all along. Not Paul, not Cynthia. Someone who had never truly left the library. The pattern wasn't just in the dates, it was in the cover, the copies, the silence between the pages, and now the last page was turning. The morning sun filtered weakly through low clouds as Miss Marple sat across from Inspector Cray in his temporary office, the familiar creak of the village floorboards beneath her feet. She placed the reversed bookend gently on the table between them. Its weight, though modest, seemed to anchor everything in the room. Cray stared at it, frowning at the base where the faded stamp, St. Edmund's Hall, confirmed its origin. It's identical to the one we saw in Sneed's study, he said quietly. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, but only one remains there now. This one I found in the Harper house, tucked behind the lower shelf in her parlor. It had been moved, perhaps used to prop open something at one time. Someone meant to leave it as nothing more than furniture. But it was a mistake. Cray's brow furrowed. You're certain it wasn't Sneed who placed it there? Quite certain. Edward Sneed never returned to Rose Cottage after the initial search. And he wouldn't have left behind something so identifying, not after being so careful for so long. She leaned forward, voice low. But someone else used to help him shelve books. Someone who once sorted archives during the war. Someone who's been watching us all without ever standing in the spotlight. Cray sat back slowly. You think there's another player? I don't think. I know. She pulled a small paper from her handbag. A visitor's sign-in sheet from the church records. One line stood out, recent, written in a firm, upright hand, C. Remley. The initials matched the library log. A volunteer no one had ever questioned. Colin Remley, Miss Marple said softly. He took over volunteer cataloguing at the library after the war. Quiet man, always there in the mornings, often seen shelving alone. His name was mentioned once by the librarian himself in passing, and I only remembered because the librarian noted how fastidious Mr. Remley was about labelling things. In fact, the lavender ink we've traced, that was purchased under Remley's account, not Sneed's. Cray blinked. Remley. I hardly remember the man. Precisely, she said. He arranged it that way. But he's been there every step. Tuesday visits to Rose Cottage under the guise of returning borrowed items. The false initials in the vicar's log. The forging of Cynthia's name on that delivery. He was the quiet hand that smoothed every scene and erased every trace. He was the one who made Peter Redford look like the center of the web, when he was only one strand. Cray ran a hand over his mouth. But why? What could drive someone to go to such lengths? Miss Marple paused, drawing in a breath. I believe it began long before the war. Back when St. Edmund's Hall was used for sensitive communications. Colin Remley was a low-level clerk then, unnoticed, unthanked, but privy to a great many secrets. He wasn't just transcribing memos. He was absorbing them. But he wasn't named in the Harper files. He wouldn't be. He made sure of that. But he would have known about Peter Redford, his real identity, his betrayal. He would have known Cecilia's proximity to it, even if she never fully understood what she'd been caught up in. And he held on to that knowledge like a precious thing. Not out of loyalty or justice, but for control. Cray shook his head. Control. Yes, she said gently. You must understand, Inspector, Remley didn't act out of revenge or greed. He had no personal ties to Cecilia, no stake in Peter Redford's downfall. What he craved was certainty, a world he could shape. He had lived for decades as the silent one in the room, the man who saw everything, remembered every name, every face, every letter, filed and misfiled. And when he felt the balance shift, when Cecilia began pulling at the old threads, when the past threatened to write itself differently, he acted. Cray stood and began to pace. So, the letter to Florence was intercepted by Remley. Before even Sneed or Redford saw it, he read it, realized she was going to reveal everything, including the possibility of a child. And that, Miss Marple's voice grew softer, that struck at the one thing he couldn't allow, uncertainty. If Cecilia Harper's story went public, if the facts of Peter Redford's betrayal came out, the tidy archive of secrets Remley had maintained would unravel. Cray rubbed at his temple. But why go so far as to arrange a murder? Miss Marple answered with quiet certainty. Because in his mind, it wasn't a murder. It was a correction, a redaction. He believed she had veered from the proper narrative, that she'd allowed guilt to override discretion. And people like Remley, Inspector, they live in the margins. They crave order, not truth. Cray looked at her. We'll need to bring him in, quietly, no alarm. But Miss Marple was already on her feet. You won't find him at home. He hasn't lived at the address in the council files for over a year. He's taken a room above the old stationer's on Hawthorne Lane, kept under another name, R. Collier. Cray stared. You knew. I suspected when I saw the delivery slip signed under the wrong initials. A quiet man always leaves behind an alias or two, and he was too clever to make noise with his real name. Within an hour, Cray's team located the room. It was locked, the curtains drawn, but there was no attempt to run when they entered. Colin Remley stood at a writing desk, hands folded, calm. On the desk were dozens of letters, perfect copies of war files, old signatures, library cards. He'd kept everything. I only ever wanted it to stay quiet, he said, as Cray read him his rights. You people make such messes when you start remembering. When it was over, when the ink on the final statements dried, Miss Marple returned home alone. Her garden was still in bloom, the roses oblivious to the storm that had passed through the village. And yet, she stood a long while at the gate before going inside. The crimes had never been just about a woman who died on a Tuesday. They had been about control, about memory, about those who watched quietly while others lived, and finally acted when their invisible world was threatened. As she stepped into her parlor, she paused and looked at the clock. Just past 3, tea. Time and time at last for the story to rest. The following evening unfolded with a slow, deliberate calm, masking the strain coiled beneath its surface. The village had begun to breathe again, or so it seemed. Peter Renford had been transferred to a secure facility, Edward Sneed awaited trial, and Colin Remley had not spoken since his arrest. Inspector Cray, though outwardly satisfied with the capture, remained uneasy. It was Miss Marple who had reminded him, gently but firmly, that even the most meticulous conspirator rarely acts entirely alone. That thought lingered with her too, as she prepared for the final stage of what had, from the start, been a story of hidden rooms and deeper corridors. The evidence was overwhelming now. Letters intercepted, routines altered, names forged, objects repositioned as if lives were chessboards. But one question gnawed at the edge of resolution. Why had Cecilia Harper felt compelled to act when she did? What had finally made her break her silence after years of seclusion and regret? The answer hadn't been in any of the statements or documents. It hadn't been in the Florence letter or even in the recovered books. It had come instead from a glance, an accidental one. Miss Marple had cast over an old photograph on Cecilia's mantelpiece days ago. It had been moved slightly during the initial search, revealing the name of the studio embossed on the backing. Arkwell Portraits, Eastbourne. The same surname as the solicitor, Mr. Colin Arkwell, who had handled Cecilia's modest estate. He had appeared once at the tea circle, then vanished from the narrative entirely. Quiet, forgettable, respectful. Everything one expects from a provincial legal man. But when Miss Marple inquired discreetly about his office, she learned something. Curious, he had taken over the practice only recently, inheriting both the business and the name from his uncle. And before Eastbourne, he had lived in Oxford, a place where Colin Remley had once worked under an assumed post-war name. It was too clean, too easy. She asked Cray for the man's file. No criminal history. But his passport photo, when compared with a wartime image of Remley's known associates, showed a familial resemblance too precise to ignore. Miss Marple requested a meeting with Mr. Arkwell, ostensibly to discuss a bequest Cecilia had left behind. He agreed willingly, and even offered to come to her cottage. That was when she made her final preparations. She arranged the parlor, with care. The fire was lit. Tea was poured, but untouched. A small table by the window held 3 objects: Cecilia's letter, the library ledger, and the photograph with its embossed backing. Cray waited in the adjoining room, silent as stone. Miss Marple knew this wasn't just the end of an investigation, it was the edge of a cliff, and she intended to see who stepped off first. Colin Arkwell arrived precisely on time. He was dressed neatly in a grey coat, carrying a slim portfolio, and wore an expression of polite fatigue. "You must forgive the hour," he said, stepping inside. "I've had to cancel 2 appointments, but your letter made it sound rather urgent." Miss Marple gestured for him to sit, her manner warm but unreadable. "I do appreciate your time." There's just one final matter about Cecilia Harper's estate that doesn't sit right with me. He folded his hands. Of course. I'm happy to clarify anything. She turned the photograph around on the table so the embossed studio name faced him. I understand your firm handled her affairs, but this was taken years before you inherited the office. So tell me, why did she select your name and not your uncle's for her final arrangements? There was a pause, just long enough to see the calculation flicker behind his eyes. I suppose she was simply updated. My name is on the current documents. Yet the original will was never amended. Until 6 weeks before her death. She laid the letter beside the photograph. At the same time, she wrote this. A letter, not addressed to her son nor to Peter Redford, but to someone else. Someone she said had always known the full story. Someone she trusted, until she realized they were keeping secrets of their own. Arkwell leaned back. His fingers tapped once on his knee. Miss Marple, I fail to see what you're implying. I believe she chose your name because she thought she was protecting someone. I believe you encouraged that illusion. But you weren't there to protect. You were there to guide what she revealed and when. And when she began stepping beyond the lines you'd drawn. When she asked too many questions about the past, about Florence, about Colin Remley, you stepped back and let others handle it. He exhaled once, slowly. That's a rather imaginative reconstruction. Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. And yet you didn't report the Florence letter. You never acknowledged receiving it even after. Inspector Cray showed you the intercepted envelope, and most telling of all, this. She held up the ledger. Your name appears in the donation records at the library. You funded the replacement of 5 war memoirs last autumn, all 5 of which contained marked passages on treason prosecutions. All 5 of which have since been removed from circulation. His smile, when it came, was thin. You're very good. Better than I expected. I'm old, she said quietly. And people forget that the old were once young. I've seen enough men like you. Those who hide behind politeness and clerical neatness. But at some point, the truth leaks out. Through a smudged initial. A bent rule. A second cousin in the shadows. Arkwell rose. You have no proof. I don't need it, Miss Marple replied. Because you're not going to run. You're going to stay. Because if you leave now, you'll confirm everything I've just said. And then came the sound of a second cup clinking behind the door, Cray stepping forward. Arkwell's face hardened, and for a split second, his eyes flicked to the door, then to the fire iron by the hearth. But Miss Marple reached for her teacup, slow and calm, and in that hesitation the moment passed. He sat back down, this time not out of courtesy, but defeat. She was going to expose us all, he said. Even Remley was panicking. He called me, said he couldn't handle her anymore. I told him to watch her. Not to act, but he never listened. Miss Marple folded her hands. No, he did listen. He followed your silence. She was going to shame us, Arkwell murmured. For what? Protecting the state? Keeping names quiet? Preserving something from chaos? You weren't protecting the state, Miss Marple said. You were preserving a story that benefited you. A version of the past where you and your kind were always right. But history doesn't belong to the quiet. It belongs to the ones brave enough to speak. Cray moved forward then, and Arkwell didn't resist. As he stood, he turned once to Miss Marple. She would have destroyed everything. She tried, Miss Marple said, But in the end it was you who did. When the door closed behind them, the room felt still again. She looked at the cold tea, the letter, the bookend. So many ordinary things. And yet, in their silence, they had spoken everything that needed to be said. And finally, the case was whole. Rain began to fall again that night, a soft and steady whisper against the rooftops of St. Mary Mead. In the warmth of her drawing room, Miss Marple sat with her knitting, at last returned to her lap, the wool moving gently through her fingers. The fire crackled quietly, and for the first time in many days, she allowed herself the smallest breath of peace. Peter Redford had been secured, Edward Sneed's duplicity exposed, Colin Remley's manipulation untangled, and Colin Arkwell's role finally dragged into light. The web had collapsed inward, every thread accounted for. Or so she thought. It was nearly midnight when the knock came. Soft, hesitant. She opened the door to find Cynthia Redford standing on her porch, in her nightcoat and boots, rain dripping from the hem. Her eyes were wild not from fear but from something deeper, something tangled in memory and realization. Miss Marple drew her inside without a word, wrapping her in a dry shawl and leading her gently to the fire. "I couldn't sleep," Cynthia said after a long pause. "I kept thinking about that night. About everything you've said. Everything we all assumed." Miss Marple poured tea, silent, sensing what lingered beneath Cynthia's voice. "I remembered something strange," Cynthia went on. "It wasn't important then. I didn't understand it. But now it feels wrong." Miss Marple sat down beside her, waiting. "The day before my mother died," Cynthia said, "she was nervous, not frightened, but distracted. She told me she was going to change everything, that she'd written it all down. And then she said, 'They'll know what I meant, because the bookends match again.'" Miss Marple froze, the cup halfway to her lips. "I thought she was talking nonsense," Cynthia said. "Some odd habit. But she sounded so certain, like it was a code." Miss Marple rose at once, going straight to her desk and retrieving the photograph again. She turned it over, then stepped quickly to her bookshelf. Two bookends, once mismatched, now reunited. But something else had changed. The small ledger she had placed between them days ago had shifted, as if it had been moved ever so slightly, out of alignment. She pulled the ledger free. Inside was a folded page tucked neatly within its spine. Old, but not yellowed, handwritten. It wasn't a confession. It was a list. Cecilia Harper had written down every person who had visited her in the final 3 months of her life. Names, dates, times, most matched existing records. But one name stood out, appearing more often than any other, always unrecorded, in the official ledgers. It was written in Cecilia's crisp, unmistakable hand, "Lillian Brooks, T. Private Talk. No one must know. Again next Tuesday." Miss Marple sank slowly into her chair. The fire crackled, the teacups sat untouched. Cynthia sat still, watching her. "What does it mean?" Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Her thoughts reeled backward. Lillian, Cecilia's sister, frail, gentle, overwhelmed in grief. The one person who had remained seemingly uninvolved, from beginning to end. But now the pattern twisted once more. Cecilia had not visited her every Tuesday. Lillian had come to her. And Cecilia hadn't died on a Tuesday. She had died on a Wednesday morning. Miss Marple stood and reached for her coat. 15 minutes later, they were at Lillian's home in East Whitlow. Inspector Cray joined them at the doorway, summoned by a quiet message Miss Marple had sent just before leaving. The constable on duty stepped aside without protest. Lillian answered the door herself, wrapped in a shawl, her hands trembling at the sight of Miss Marple in the dark. "Is something wrong?" she asked. "May we come in?" Miss Marple said gently. "There's one last thing we need your help understanding." Lillian hesitated, then nodded, stepping back. Inside, the house was warm and still. Cray remained silent, watching. Miss Marple didn't bother with preamble. "You were at Rose Cottage the morning Cecilia died." Lillian blinked, but said nothing. "She'd asked you to come. You'd spoken every Tuesday in private. She trusted you, shared more with you than anyone else." "She was my sister," Lillian whispered. "Of course we spoke." "But you didn't want her to speak to others," Miss Marple said. "Especially not about Peter Redford or Colin Remley. You were the one who convinced her to stay silent for so long." "She was protecting people," Lillian said quickly. "She didn't want scandal. She didn't want chaos." "No," Miss Marple said. "You didn't want chaos. You'd helped cover it all up. You'd encouraged her to keep the child a secret. You'd written those false delivery slips, not out of malice but out of fear. You believed that one secret would unravel the life you'd built around silence." Lillian sank into a chair, white as chalk. "She was going to send the letter," she said. "I begged her not to. She wouldn't listen." "So you returned the next morning," Miss Marple continued softly. "Not to hurt her, just to try once more. But she was resolute. She told you she had finished everything, left a copy of the list inside the library ledger. That was when you panicked. You didn't mean for her to die, but you moved her, hid the list, burned the wrong page. And when the others came, Remley, Sneed, Redford, you let the web form around them." Cray stepped forward, face grim. "You let them be caught, knowing your hand was the first to set the chain in motion." "I didn't know what else to do," Lillian whispered. "I thought if I said nothing it would stop." Miss Marple's voice was soft but final. "But secrets never stop. They only pause, and then they return, more cruelly than before." Cray placed a hand gently on Lillian's shoulder, and she made no effort to resist. As the constable escorted her out, the house fell into silence once more. Outside, dawn was beginning to lift the edge of the sky. Cynthia stood beside Miss Marple, silent in the early light. "After all that," she said, "it was her. The one person she trusted." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "It always is in the end. The person who knows the truth and fears it most." They turned back toward the village as the morning began to stir. The last twist unfurled, and the final shadow laid bare. By the time the village fully awoke, the news had already begun to ripple through St. Mary Mead. Soft voices in corner shops, sideways glances in front gardens, cautious steps around the matter as if saying too much might awaken something still unfinished. Lillian Brooks had been quietly taken into custody. No official charges had yet been announced, only a careful statement from Inspector Cray confirming her involvement in obstructing justice and concealing evidence. The true details were not spoken aloud in the bakery queue or the pews of St. Mary's, but the knowing look said enough. For once, even the most talkative villagers held back, not out of fear, but from reverence. This story had gone deeper than any of them had expected. Miss Marple as always returned to her own routine with the same grace that had carried her through every twist and revelation. But Cray arrived that afternoon, not in pursuit of an update, but for closure. He sat stiffly in her parlor, hat balanced on his knee, the fire burning low. She poured his tea unhurried, before settling across from him. "She's confessed," he said after a moment. "To moving the body, to hiding the list, to sending anonymous notes to Redford to bait his return." Miss Marple stirred her cup, but not to causing her sister's death. No, she insists Cecilia collapsed on her own, stress perhaps. Or her heart finally gave out. Miss Marple didn't look surprised. That may very well be true. But even if it was, Lillian took control of the scene, not from cruelty, but from fear. That decision set the rest into motion. Cray leaned forward slightly, and yet it wasn't Lillian who poisoned the Florence letter. The ink on the envelope was laced with a subtle alkaloid, meant to cause confusion, dizziness, Sneed, or Remley maybe. She shook her head. Neither. The envelope wasn't meant to harm. It was meant to delay. And only one person had access. To both the courier line and Cecilia's medications. Someone trusted, unobtrusive. Cray's expression tensed. "The village chemist." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "Mr. Calverton. A widower. Quiet. Rather overlooked. But he was an old friend of Remley's. They served together during the war. I noticed the pharmacy ledger had a small discrepancy. A prescription marked for Cecilia on the same day the Florence letter was posted, but never collected. And a courier fee recorded under another name, one he used only in his early service years, Colin R. Cray stood slowly, absorbing it. "So we'll add conspiracy to the charges, or at least obstruction. If you can find him," Miss Marple said gently. "He's gone. Left just before Lillian was taken in. Perhaps he feared being the next thread pulled. He may have slipped away for now, but not forever." Cray paced once by the hearth. "It's like a web inside a web. Everyone involved convinced they were protecting something, reputation, stability, family. And in doing so," Miss Marple said softly, "they smothered the one woman who tried to bring truth into the open." Cray sat again, this time with less tension. "What I still don't understand is how you saw it. How you knew Lillian had been there the morning Cecilia died." "It was the bookends," she replied. "Cecilia said they matched again. And only Lillian would know what that meant. They had been split, one in her home, one with Cecilia. That was their sign, a private signal. And when they were reunited, it meant the truth had been written down, prepared. Lillian knew that. And when she saw the match, she knew she'd run out of time." Cray let the silence stretch, staring at the fire. "So you saw the pattern before the rest of us?" "No," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "I saw the people. Patterns follow people, not the other way around." He smiled faintly. "I hope I never find myself on the wrong end of your knitting needles," she chuckled. "Then don't lie in small ways. They're always the ones that unravel." That evening, as dusk fell again over the hedges and winding lanes, Miss Marple took a slow walk to Rose Cottage. The constables had cleared the scene, and the gate hung open in a wind that smelled of damp leaves. She stepped inside not to investigate, but to remember. The air was still now, no more whispers between the bookshelves or shadows by the writing desk. She walked once more to the shelf where the two bookends had been, solid, unremarkable, now reunited on either side of Cecilia's modest library. She rested her hand on one of them. A gesture of respect, perhaps, or gratitude. For Cecilia, Harper had died not because she was weak, but because she was brave. Because after decades of silence, she had chosen to speak. She turned back to the desk, where the blotter had been replaced. The pen sat capped, the ink bottle full again. But there was no new letter this time. Only absence, the quiet kind that lingered after something final. Outside, the evening was falling thick and blue across the rooftops. Miss Marple stepped back into the lane. The wind brushed softly through the hedgerows, as though carrying with it the last sigh of a secret now freed. Justice had come, not as a shout, but as a whisper. Not with finality, but with understanding. And while not every culprit would face trial, the truth had been named. That, too, was justice, in its quietest, clearest form. She walked home slowly, the last light behind her, the firelight ahead. The morning after her quiet visit to Rose Cottage, Miss Marple returned to her routine as if nothing had changed. The kettle whistled gently on the hob. The sparrows returned to the hedge, and her knitting resumed its measured rhythm. But in her mind, one thread remained uneven, an edge not quite bound. The case was, for all official purposes, closed. Cecilia. Harper's death explained, her secrets unearthed, and the tangle of wartime loyalties and deceptions laid bare under patient scrutiny. Lillian Brooks faced questioning. Colin Remley and Colin Arkwell would not return to St. Mary Mead. Peter Redford, though still denying certain truths, now answered to a larger court. Yet even in resolution, something remained unsettled. Not loud, not urgent, but present. The village had responded to the aftermath with remarkable decorum. Rose Cottage, though still under the watchful eye of the authorities, had been left untouched out of respect. The locals had returned to their habits, though with a gentler tone in their gossip, as though the closeness of tragedy had softened their appetite for rumour. The vicar's wife had taken to quoting scripture about truth and redemption over tea, and the grocer now offered quiet nods, rather than prying questions. Miss Marple received a final letter from Inspector Cray that week, short, courteous and grateful. No one, he had written, sees what you see. It's not the facts you find, it's the spaces between them. She smiled at that, not out of pride, but out of recognition. He had begun to understand. Still, she could not ignore the feeling. It came each evening as the sun dipped behind the trees in the hush that came just before dusk. A moment of pause, always then, when the mind wandered to things left behind. She thought again of the list Cecilia Harper had hidden inside the library ledger. Names, dates, visits. But one entry, one very small line, had slipped past notice. A final scribble on the bottom corner, barely legible. Return, LG, unspoken. She hadn't noticed it at first. It had seemed like a filing note, something internal, a reminder perhaps, but LG did not match any names directly involved. It wasn't Lillian, nor any of the known contacts from Cecilia's wartime days. And unspoken. The word felt too intentional, too private. She pulled the list from her side table once more and studied it again. The other names followed. A logic. Library clerks, tea guests, postal contacts. But this one stood alone. The next day, she visited the village archives. The librarian, new, young, eager to please, brought out the staff records when asked. "We're still organizing. Since Mr. Sneed's departure," she explained, "some of the older files haven't been properly indexed yet." Miss Marple smiled. "That's quite all right. I'm rather good at reading what's been left out." She found it in the second drawer. Louisa Garside, temporary assistant during the spring of 1944. No departure date recorded, only a note. In the margin, absent, after May. No formal resignation. She searched further. There were no subsequent records of employment, no village address. Not even a mention in the vicar's marriage or funeral registries. Louisa Garside had entered briefly, and then vanished. And Cecilia had remembered her. After all those years, not as a witness, not as a visitor, but as something unspoken. The air in the archive felt colder now. Miss Marple stepped out into the sunlight with her thoughts layered in quiet weight. Louisa Garside. Who had she been to Cecilia Harper? A friend, a confidant, or someone else entirely? She walked slowly through the lane behind the church, one often unused now, its cobbles weathered with moss. It led to an old building, once used for clerical housing, now boarded. But she remembered. During the war, it had served as temporary quarters for staff connected with St. Edmund's Hall. And Louisa Garside's name had not appeared in any public records because she had never been formally posted. She had lived here, briefly, hidden in plain sight. She pushed open the gate, long disused, creaking slightly, and stood for a moment at the threshold. There was no need to go inside, not yet, but her mind was already there. Had Louisa seen something? Had she been involved? Or was she the last name in a chain of witnesses Cecilia had once counted as friends, and more importantly, had she returned? Miss Marple returned home in silence that evening, setting aside the list once again. But not discarding it. There were no more crimes to solve, no immediate danger. But there was a shape forming behind the curtain of history. A name Cecilia had dared not say aloud, yet written down at the end. The kind of clue that meant nothing in court, but everything to a woman who had carried too much alone. As the sky deepened into its usual lavender blue, Miss Marple took her tea outside into the garden. The roses were beginning to nod, touched with dew, and the breeze held the faintest scent of the earth turning toward autumn. She sat quietly, knitting in her lap once more, and allowed herself to rest. But her eyes drifted now and then to the far end of the lane, to the old path near the rectory, and the house with the boarded windows. Because somewhere behind one of them, she suspected, another story waited. Not of murder, perhaps, not yet, but of something that had gone missing once, long ago, and when it returned, as all secrets eventually did, she would be there, waiting, listening, and ready.